Hey, it's Ben Wilmore, and here I'm going to show you a feature known as Knockout in Photoshop. It has a setting of either deep or shallow. We'll take a look at both, and we'll start off using it for the most common use, which is to make one layer knock a hole in the layer that's underneath it. Oftentimes it's done with text. But then we'll progress, and I'll show you how it can also be useful when you want to convert your image to black and white, and when you want to apply adjustments and have more than one mask. But let's dive in and see how it works. Here's an image I'm going to start with. Here we have a geyser. I took this photograph in Iceland. So I have some text that I have on a layer above that just says Iceland. It's full of blue. And then I have a layer below that that has simply a black bar. And right now it might look like the blue that's in here is showing through to the sky, but it's not. It's just the color of the text happens to be similar to the sky. What I'd like to have happen is I would like this to break through this black bar that's here so I can see the photograph that's below. And I can do that using Knockout. Well, how do I get to Knockout? You have a couple different ways to get to it. The first is you can go to the letters FX at the bottom of your layers panel and go up here and choose a choice called blending options. If you do that, you're going to find Knockout right in here, and you'll see that we have shallow and deep. But there are two other ways you can access that same screen, and the next one is to go to your layer and double click on it. But don't double click the eyeball, don't double click the thumbnail, don't double click the name, double click out here in the empty space. If you do, that'll bring you to the same screen. There's a third way to do it, and that is to go to the layer menu, go down here to layer style, and there you'll find blending options. But it doesn't matter which one of those techniques you use, it brings you to the same spot. So then let's see what happens if I change this menu from Knockout from none to shallow, and I see nothing. Let's set it to deep, and heck, let's click OK, and I still see nothing. Well, that's because the blue that's filling the text is still filling the text, but there is a hole that's being created through all layers that are underneath the layer that says Iceland, and it's knocking a hole all the way down until it finds the background. That's what Knockout Deep means. So now we just need to do something in order to get that text to be something you could see through. We can do that in many different ways. We could change the blending mode. If I were to set it to multiply, for instance, now you might be able to see a little bit of a hint of the geyser showing through the L and the A, but the blue of the text is still kind of overprinting on what's underneath. So let's set that back to normal. Otherwise, we can come over here to the word fill. If I lower fill, the real contents of that layer, the blueness of the text, will be lessened, but it will still use its shape to poke a hole through whatever is underneath it. So right now I have the fill set to 0. And if I just had nothing underneath but the photo, you wouldn't see the text at all. But since it's set to Knockout, it's poking a hole through all layers that are underneath it until it finds the background. Well, there's a problem with that. I also have an adjustment layer in here. It's currently turned off, but what it does is it brightens up the geyser. So I'm going to turn that on, and you'll find that the geyser gets bright up through here, but right there it's not getting bright. And that's because this layer called Iceland is poking a hole through all layers that are underneath it until it gets to the background. I want to get it to only poke through this one layer that's here. To do so, I'm going to select the two layers that I want to interact here. I just held Shift and I clicked on the bottom layer, and I'm going to put it in a folder. The folder is known as a group, and I'm just going to click on that. Now let's open up that folder, and let's work again on that layer that says Iceland. And if you've applied the feature that I showed you called Knockout, you're going to find these two little squares overlapping. That indicates that some setting in that screen we were in is applied. And you can double click on that to get back into it. Well, now if you look at what we have, Knockout is set to deep. Deep always means knock all the way through absolutely everything until you hit a layer called background. Well, let's change it from deep to shallow. And when I do, watch what happens to the geyser where it's right inside of the text. When I set it to shallow, do you notice that it brightened up? I'll show you again. I'll set it back to deep, and then I'll set it back to shallow, and you see it lightened up. That's because Knockout Shallow means only knock through layers that are contained within the same group as the layer that's set to knockout. And therefore, now the word Iceland is only knocking through this one layer here and is not knocking through this one. So, knockout shallow means knock through what's in this folder, and knockout deep means knock all the way until you hit the background. If you didn't have a background, like if I click this little lock symbol, then everything still works right now because we're set to knockout shallow. But if I go back into there and I set it to knockout deep, it's going to search for a layer called background, and when it doesn't find it, it will just knock all the way through and just look transparent. And so you do need a layer that is the background when you use knockout deep. If you don't have one, just take whichever layer you'd like to be the background, go to the layer menu, choose new, and you'll find a choice of background from layer. And then you'll have a background. But in this particular case, I think the knockout shallow was a better choice because I did want my geyser to be brightened. Now you can dress this up a bit. I could go to that black rectangle that's there and I could add a layer style. In this case, a drop shadow. I'm just going to turn it on so you can see a hint of a little drop shadow there. I could also go to the text and I could add a layer style to it by going down to the letters FX and this time choosing inner shadow. I've already done that. I just have it disabled. I'm going to turn it back on, so watch the text and you'll now see it has a little shadow inside of the text. So we can spice it up a bit with layer styles. But now let's move on to more complex uses for knockout deep and knockout shallow. In this case, what I'd like to do is I have a magnifying glass and I want to have it reveal what it would look like if I were to print this image in the newspaper and then look really close at it like through a magnifying glass. So I'm going to just work on this layer and use my move tool. I already have it set up, and let's see what happens when I move this around over the image. Notice it looks like a halftone. That's the kind of reproduction you would get in a newspaper. If you looked really, really close, you'd see those dots making up the image. Well, how am I doing that? Let's take a look in our layers panel. I'm going to turn off all the layers so we can reveal what's on the bottommost layer. Here I have a copy of the truck, and all I've done to that particular layer is to apply a choice in here that is called color halftone. And I just applied that with default settings, and it came up with this version of the image. And that's what I'd like to reveal when I move the magnifying glass around. So let's turn on some of the other layers and see how it was done. Here's my magnifying glass. It's sitting on its own layer. It's had the background removed on it so you can see right through where the glass would be. Then I have also a copy of the original truck put on a layer above. And so we have that stack. Then I have here what used to be a simple red circle. If I turn on its eyeball and I take the setting called fill and turn it all the way up, you'd see it's a red circle that matches the shape of the magnifying glass. Both the magnifying glass and that circle are inside of a group. And that's simply so I would move the group and the magnifying glass would move along with the red circle, because whenever that's active, you're moving everything that's inside. But then I take this circle that's here and I go into that screen and I set it to knockout deep. Remember, deep means knock all the way through all layers until you hit the background. Remember what's on our background, I'll show you for a moment. This is what we're going to reveal when we knock out deep. But now we still have the red circle in the way, and that's where fill opacity comes in. I had a separate video just about fill opacity you're welcome to watch, but all you need to know is when you're using knockout, you could bring it down to 0 and the real contents of that layer disappear, but wherever it would usually show up will knock through what's underneath. So this is set to knockout deep. That means knock all the way through our background. So now if I click on that group, I can use my move tool and move this all around my image. If I don't want those pink lines showing up, all I need to do is go to the view menu, go to my extras, and turn off smart guides. That's what those were. And now I have that effect. And I've used an effect like this to demonstrate how are things reproduced on inkjet printers, on newspapers and everything when I needed to teach those subjects. But now you get a sense for one way you could do that. But let's look at other uses for knockout. Here I have an image I wanted to convert to black and white. If I turn off the adjustment layers that are above, we can see what the original looked like. And let me recreate the two layers that are above because they allow me to have a much more control over this black and white conversion. To convert this image to black and white, I'm going to add an adjustment layer that's called black and white. And when I'm in here, I can move these sliders around to control how bright areas are. If I click on this hand tool, I can even click on my image, and Photoshop will look at what color did this area used to be, and I could darken it or brighten it depending on what I would like. And so I can dial that in exactly how I'd like it to look. Then I could click on another area like what used to be the blue sky and adjust it separately to try to get exactly what I like. But on occasion, you won't be able to get the entire image to look the way you'd like. For instance, in this case, there's a badge on the door of the car. And if I were to turn off this black and white adjustment layer, look at the badge. You notice that there used to be text on it that said Highway Patrol. It's kind of yellowish in color. But because of the adjustment that was applied, when I turn this on, I can't really read it anymore. I also dislike the way the bricks look over here. If I turn off this layer, before you could see a lot more contrast between the various colors in the bricks. If I turn it on, now you don't. So what I really want is I want a second black and white adjustment layer that uses different combination of these sliders, possibly moving them in opposite directions as we have now, and then I want to be able to paint it in right where I want it. Well, here's the problem. If I come in here and create a second black and white adjustment layer right on top of the original one, well, this adjustment looks at what's underneath, and that's what it's adjusting, and just below it is that black and white adjustment layer, which means the only thing this particular adjustment layer can see is the black and white version of the picture. And in there, there's nothing that's red, nothing that's yellow, nothing that's green. So these sliders do nothing at all when I move them around. It doesn't matter how radical I move them, nothing will happen because there is no color as far as this adjustment layer is concerned. That is, unless I have this layer knock through the layer that's underneath so it can see the color that's in the background. If I just go beyond the name over here to this empty space and double click, I could set knockout to deep. And now this layer is going to knock a hole straight through the other one that's below, and it will be able to see the black or the color version of the image that's underneath. Now moving the sliders to these absurd settings makes it look bad. Part of that is also this is a JPEG, so it degrades. But I'm going to hit this little U-turn symbol, which will reset us back to default settings. And now let's optimize it for either the badge of the car or over here where the bricks are. Now, I don't think I'd be able to use this hand tool, which usually allows me to click on the image, because I don't think it's going to know that we're set to knockout mode. But I can know that some of those bricks were reddish, and I might want to darken those. And so I'm going to bring that down, and I'm going to see if anything was yellowish in there. Yes, there was. I'll bring that up so we get much more separation in those bricks. And let's say that's the setting I'd like to use for this portion of the image. Then I want to use a third set of settings for the badge on the car. So let's create an additional black and white adjustment layer, and let's double click to the right of its name and set it to knock out deep. So it knocks through the other layers that are there. Then I might zoom up here on this, and I believe that used to be yellowish orange. So if I bring up the yellow slider, that's probably going to make that separate much more than it used to. And I could experiment with the other sliders to see what I might prefer for that badge. Some of the sliders won't do anything, but other ones will make a big difference when it comes to the look of that badge. And so once I have this the way I like it, and I think I do right now, now let's blend those three versions together. Because the first version that I used, if I turn off the top two, watch the sign and look at the big triangular shape that's there. See how bright it was and how it contrasted with the sky? That's what I wanted in that area. Then I can turn on these other two adjustment layers, and they're helping in other areas. This topmost one here, I don't think is helping the bricks, if you look. I think it's only something I'd like to apply to where the badge was. So let's work on the layer mask to control where this applies. When the layer mask is white, it applies to everything, and that means it's knocking through the entirety of the two layers that are underneath. I'm going to instead adjust that mask and I'm going to invert it. That's going to take the areas that were white and make them black. That's going to make it so that particular adjustment is not applying anywhere. Then I'll paint with white only where I want it to apply, which is right here where the badge was on the car. So we have that applying only in that area. And since this mask only has white in that tiny little spot, it's only that tiny little spot that is now knocking through the two layers that are below. And so if I turn this off and on, you can see it's only affecting the badge on the car. Then the layer below I made so that we could get the bricks over here to look good, but I don't like what it does to the big arrow on the side. So let's do the same thing. Let's invert the mask so that it doesn't apply anywhere. And then you see how boring the bricks look down here. Well, let's grab our paintbrush tool once again. Let's paint with white and let's paint it in just where those bricks are so it can apply just there. Now, again, only the areas painted with white are where it knocks through this adjustment layer that is below. We don't need to paint on its mask at all. If we did, we might reveal the color photograph that is all the way at the bottom. So this is something where if you want to have much more control over a black and white image, the problem is usually when you have one layer that converts something to black and white, all layers above it are simply looking at what's underneath them, as if you turned off their eyeball and revealed what was there, and that's the data that it's working with. If it's already black and white, a black and white adjustment layer is not going to do anything. But if that black and white adjustment layer is set to knock out deep, then it's going to poke a hole all the way through all other layers until it hits the background. And if that's your full color picture, then you can have multiple of them stacked on top of each other. Let's see how we can use this knockout setup to get more masks when we're making adjustments. On this particular image, I have complex end result. Let's take a look. Here's my original. With my original, I did some retouching. It needed to get rid of this tower, the telephone lines, and a bunch of other stuff. So that's done on some layers here. You can see how it cleaned up a bunch of the image. Then I ended up enhancing the image to try to get it so this pump might look more similar to the other and just fine-tune the colors. Like look at how dull these green areas are up here. Well, with my enhancements, you'll see that all those areas have been optimized. It just contains a bunch of adjustment layers. But then I wanted to give this a semi-vintage feel by making it not quite as colorful as it was originally, and I really wanted to control where your attention was drawn. And right now with the greens and the trees and the blues in the sky, your eye is really welcome to explore anywhere. So now I'm going to turn on this little group that's here and let's see what it does to this image. I'm going to turn these layers on, and when I do, you'll notice it becomes a little bit less colorful. That's because I have a black and white adjustment layer right here, and it's at 50% opacity. If I were to bring it up to 100% opacity, you would see that a good portion of the image goes black and white, like the sky. But notice that this black and white adjustment layer does not have a mask attached to it. You might not be used to seeing these particular symbols. You're only going to get those if you have small thumbnails here in your layers panel and you have a wide picture, like a panorama. If you want to see these look more normal, I'll right-click down here and I can choose the size of my thumbnails. I bet you if I bring it up to medium, you'll see more of the normal thumbnails that would be there. Might look a little bit more familiar. So let's see how this was done because knockout was used. So what I'd like to do here is I don't want to use knockout deep. If I did, it would knock right through all this retouching that is in this folder, and it would knock right through all of these enhancements that are making the colors look just right. But what I did is I had a black and white adjustment layer, which is right here, and I wanted to have many different masks. So here's what I ended up doing. Let's turn these off and I'll recreate one of them. So here is just the black and white adjustment layer. It's sitting inside of a group, and I'm going to put the layers I'm about to create also inside the same group. So with this layer active, I'm just going to make a brand new adjustment layer, and I'm going to create what is known as an empty adjustment layer. What an empty adjustment layer is any adjustment layer that would not change the image whatsoever. So levels is one. If you never move these sliders, you leave them at their default position, you haven't adjusted the picture yet. So this is an empty adjustment. You could also use curves, brightness and contrast, and many other adjustments that wouldn't change your image if you didn't move any of the sliders. Well, if that's an empty adjustment layer, this mask controls where it would apply. And I want it so this mask will poke a hole through our black and white adjustment layer to reveal what's underneath. To do so, I'm going to use Knockout. So I'll double click in this empty area to the right of the layer's name, and I'm going to set this to Knockout, not Deep, because remember, Deep would knock all the way through to the background. There's not even a background layer in here. I want to prevent it from knocking through my enhancements or my retouching, so I'm going to set it to Knockout Shallow, and I'll click OK. Now it thinks that this adjustment layer would affect the entirety of the image because this mask here is white, and therefore this is knocking a hole all the way through our black and white adjustment layer, making it not apply anywhere. But I'm just going to take this mask, I got to click on it to make it active, and I'm going to invert it so it's black instead. And that means it wouldn't apply anywhere. So the image will come back to full color. Then let's say I want to have a little bit less of this black and white. I want to see a hint of the color come through where the sky is. Well, I can go to the select menu up here and say I want to select the sky. And it should give me an okay selection of the sky, but I do see where it's inaccurate. You see over here some of the sign is included, and over here some of the building isn't. I'm going to ignore that for now. I could always touch it up later, but all I'm going to do now is, since I have that area selected, I'm going to make that part of my mask white. Many different ways of doing that, one of which would be, in this case, just choosing invert once again. Since invert means give me the opposite of what I currently have, in that adjustment layer I have black, and when I invert I should get white where the sky is. And that pokes a hole through our black and white adjustment layer. But I don't want all of the color showing up where the sky is. I want it to only have a little hint showing up. So what I'm going to do is take this empty adjustment layer that's here, and I'm going to lower the opacity. Not the fill. Fill would make it still knock all the way through, just like it did when we had text, but opacity would actually lessen the effect. So I'll click on the word opacity, I'll drag far to the left, it goes to 0. I see my black and white version, then I drag to the right until I get just enough color in the sky where it doesn't feel black and white. And I'm thinking somewhere right around there, I'm seeing just enough blue in this area to get that to work. Then I might decide to select all the trees. I'm not going to spend the time to do that right now. Instead, I'm going to cheat. I have a selection already built into one of these other masks. If I command click on it, control clicking if I was in Windows, it will load it as a selection. And I'm just going to create another empty adjustment layer. And just to show you that you can use just about any kind of adjustment layer that would not already change your image with default settings, I'll use brightness and contrast. And I'm simply not going to move those sliders at all. Since I had a selection active at the time I made the adjustment, my selection got converted into the mask. Let's go down here to the letters FX and head up to blending options, and let's tell that layer to knock out shallow. So it knocks through any layers that are found inside the same group, and that's going to cause the trees to come back to full color. I don't want them to be full color though, so I'm going to adjust the opacity. I'll click on the word opacity, drag far to the left, it goes to 0. I'll see black and white trees because the opacity is at 0. Then I'll slowly bring this up higher and higher until I think the trees are just right. And for me, most of the time around 50 to 65% for these kind of vintage looking pictures gives you just enough of a feeling that there's color in those trees. Then I would move on and I would say, where do I really want you to look? I would like you to look at this bus. I actually own that bus. It's been painted since then. If you want to see it, go to creativecruiser.com and you can see details. I've lived on it full time for a while in the past. Well, I'm going to make a selection of the areas where I really want your eyes to go. And let's say there are these areas. I have a little air pump here on the wall. I have all of the bus, and I have these pumps, and I also have the sign over on the left. And I'm just going to create another empty adjustment layer. I usually just standardize on one kind, but to let you know, you can use most of these kinds. Not black and white though, because that does not leave the image looking the normal way before you move the sliders. It changes the look. But here I'll use hue and saturation just to show you that you could use it, because if I leave these sliders at 0, it has not changed the image at all yet. Then I'm going to come in here and double click to the right of the name of the layer, and I'm going to set it to Knockout Shallow. And therefore those areas are now going to come in to full color, and I'm going to leave them that way. Then I would end up choosing a few other areas to work on, but in this case, I don't really want anything to be fully black and white. So I'm going to come down here to the black and white adjustment layer itself and lower it. If I lower the opacity of it, it will be able to apply less and it will reveal more of the color photo that's underneath. And so if I dial that back just a bit, maybe down to about 80%, somewhere like that, it's going to feel as if we have generally a color picture because there's color everywhere, but I've really controlled where your eye is going to look because it's only the bust, the pumps, and the sign that are full color. And I can now return to any of these other layers. Let's say I'd like to go to the one that controls the trees, and maybe I decide I want to increase or decrease the opacity. I can just fine tune it. Maybe the sky is a little too much, so I come down here to the layer that controls that, and I end up making it a little higher or a little bit lower to control exactly how much that is. Most of the time, if you had an adjustment layer for black and white and you created a complex mask, coming in and making changes later is difficult. But when you end up using Knockout, you can have as many of these empty adjustment layers above as you'd like, and adjust the opacity of every one. So I made these 3 during this lesson, but I'm going to select those 3 and throw them away because I already have these that I originally created in here, so I can get to my general end result. If you want to see what this is doing as a whole, I'll just turn off the eyeball for the group as a whole, and you'll see what it looked like as a full color image, where your eye now can go anywhere. And my eye gets drawn to this area here and a little bit to the sky, so it pings around between the image. When I turn this group back on, though, my eye doesn't ping around anymore. And it just might be that part of it feels a little bit fake, so maybe I come in here to the trees and I say, well, let's fine tune that, get just a hint more color in there. And maybe I go to the area that affects the station itself and I can fine tune it. In the original version of this, I didn't isolate the sky. The sky got whatever that black and white adjustment layer was, its strength was set to. But if I turn these layers off, you can see what it would look like with just the black and white adjustment. Looks kind of dull. Then I can end up adjusting my trees to bring some more color back in. The layer that I call Look Here, which is opacity to 100%. And then those little lamps up here are getting a little bit more with this one. And then the station itself is brought in. So in this case, you can see how empty adjustment layers, these happen to be curves adjustment layers, but if I were to inspect any one of them, they don't contain an actual adjustment. Nothing has been moved in here. These are only here so they can poke a hole through this particular adjustment layer, and that's because they're all set to Knockout Shallow. Remember, shallow means only knock through the layers that are contained within this group and ignore all the layers that are down here. And therefore, this retouching that is here does not get knocked out, and nor do these enhancements that are fine-tuning the color. Now, I also use fill opacity, and I have a video on that topic which you can watch here. I'm Ben Wilmore from Digital Mastery and Masters Academy, and I'll see you next time.